This meal is a meal that tells a story. Now, many meals actually do tell stories about what we value or who we are. Whether the table holds frozen food or a home-cooked spread or takeout, the vegetables, the meat, the grains on our plates all say something about our choices and values, our likes and our dislikes, even our relationships. But the particular meal that we're talking about today is a meal that was designed on purpose to tell a particular story. A meal that was designed to make us part of the story. Now, you've probably heard the story before. We tell this chapter of this story every time that we celebrate the Eucharist. But it's important to listen to the story again tonight. This is a story told in 3 of the 4 Gospels and by the evangelist Paul, writing to his friends in Corinth. On the night before Jesus died, they tell us, though his friends didn't know at that time what was going to happen the next day, on the night Jesus died, he gathered his followers and his friends around him to share a meal. The meal that they shared might have been a Passover meal, a meal that was particularly designed dish by dish to tell the story of how God's people had been oppressed and enslaved in Egypt, and how God had used a series of disasters to save the people, to set them free, and then to bring them to the home that God had prepared for them. But even if the meal they shared that night was not exactly a Passover meal, still Jesus' friends would have known the story of the Passover, and they would have had that in mind and understood that Jesus was telling them a new story, an equally important story, when he blessed bread and wine that night and shared it with them. Paul tells us, and Mark and Matthew and Luke tell us, that at that particular meal, Jesus picked up bread, the most basic element on the table, the daily food of rich and poor alike. Jesus picked up the bread, and Jesus said a traditional blessing, giving thanks to God for creating bread. And then Jesus said something new. "This bread is my body," he told them. "Eat this bread. Remember me." I wonder what his friends thought that night. I'm sure they all ate. I mean, how can you not eat when Jesus hands you bread? But I wonder what they thought. Why would Jesus have said to them that this bread was his body? Did it feel weird or did it feel wonderful to them to hear that? What did it feel like then to actually eat bread that your friend had said was his flesh? I'd like to invite you to take a few minutes now to pause the video and imagine what it would be like to be at that table, to know Jesus well, but not know what you and I know about the Eucharist 2,000 years later. But imagine what his friends thought being at that table. Pause the video and talk to the people you are sharing your meal with tonight, or simply take a few minutes to reflect and imagine yourself there by yourself. Now, Paul and Mark and Matthew and Luke all tell us also that at the same meal, Jesus picked up a cup of wine from the table. That he said the traditional blessing, giving thanks to God for creating wine, and then said something new to them. "This is my blood. This cup is the new covenant," he said. Now, depending on which of those storytellers is telling the story, Jesus might also have said to them, "This is poured out for you for the forgiveness of sins." Or Jesus might have said, "Drink this and remember me." Or even, "I will not drink again until God's kingdom comes." Jesus' friends would have remembered, though, when Jesus said, "This is the new covenant," they would have remembered that God has had a habit of making covenants with the people of Israel. Covenants that make us into God's own people. In those covenants, God promises to protect us and to bless us. And in return, we promise to love God and to do as God commands and teaches us. Jesus' friends that night would also have known that sometimes in the history of Israel, covenants were made formal by the shedding or the sharing of blood, a symbolic blood that makes us into family. to blood kin. So there was a lot for Jesus' friends to think about that night when he invited them to drink from that particular cup. I wonder how they felt about that. Did it feel to them like that sip of wine was getting a new promise of God's love in the new covenant Jesus mentioned? Did they feel strange taking a sip of something that was supposed to be blood? What else might they have thought and felt, hearing and seeing and tasting bread and wine the way no one had ever tasted it before? Take a few minutes right now to reflect on that. Pause the video to help you reflect. Think about it yourself or talk about it in conversation around your dinner table. Imagine yourself at Jesus' table as you take a sip from your own glass. Imagine yourself, what it felt like to be sitting close together that night with people that you had only met because of Jesus, sharing dishes around the table and telling stories to one another. Imagine eating a meal jammed close together at a table with people that you never would have chosen to have dinner with people you might not have known, but they're all of them friends of Jesus. It probably feels a little strange to be imagining this crowded table when we're sitting in our separate homes in this time of not being close to so many people. But for thousands of years, small groups of people remembering and imagining this meal with Jesus have trusted that eating bread and drinking wine in the name of Jesus will bring us to that same table where Jesus' friends have eaten for centuries. That the meal we have tonight, whatever that meal is in Jesus' honor, the meal that tells a story connects us closely together, as close as a single body, even when we are far apart in time and in space. So take a few minutes again to think about all of the people who are sharing Jesus' table with you now. Think about the people that you long to be with at God's table today. People from any time and place in history, perhaps. People who are close to you but far away today. Imagine, too, who would it surprise you to find at God's table? Picking up the same plate of bread, sharing a cup of wine with you. This time when we have to be apart from one another to care for one another. This time when the meal that brings us together is set separately on so many different tables. On some tables, like mine, with only one person seated there. In this strange time, it gives me profound comfort to remember that this table right now, this table is connected by meal and by story to the table of Jesus, both the table long ago and far away in the Jerusalem of the first century, and the table that Jesus spreads among us at every moment in history. It gives me comfort to be together with you because we share the meal and the story. The story that this meal is meant to tell us is one of generosity and love, of Jesus giving himself to nourish us, body, heart, and soul. The story that this meal tells about us, though, is that we belong. We belong to Jesus, we belong to God, we belong to each other. We belong with the friends of Jesus and the followers of Jesus who ate a meal with him on the night before he died. And we belong with everyone who shares this meal with us today, all over the world. We belong to all of those who share God's table and God's meal, no matter how separated in time by past and future. This meal, the meal on your table today and the meal on mine, the meal that is a story in bread and wine, is a story that tells us that we belong, soul and body, now and always, to the story of God's love.